Thank you to High on Life 2 for sponsoring this video. Comedy in games almost never ages well. That's just the reality of it.
I'm gonna get my engineers to invent a combustible lemon that burns your house down!
What?
Drama can age well, tragedy can age well, spectacle can age well, but comedy is volatile. It is tied to timing, it is tied to culture, and when you try to stretch that across a 10-hour experience, it becomes one of the hardest tones to sustain in all of gaming. That's why when High on Life originally released, it felt like such a risky game. It wasn't just a shooter with some funny lines sprinkled in. The whole game was built around being absurd, talking to alien guns that never shut up. There's corporate satire dialed up to 11, bits that refuse to end. There was entire segments that felt like they existed purely to test how long you were willing to let the joke breathe. And somehow, it worked. We got a sequel, baby. Not because it was universally loved, it definitely wasn't. A lot of people bounced off of it hard, but the people who leaned into it understood what the game was trying to do. It wasn't asking to be taken seriously. It was asking whether absurdity could carry mechanical repetition in the form of having your guns talk to you over and over again, like nonstop. They just won't stop talking. Now, here we are with High on Life 2, and the question shifts from whether absurdity works to whether it can survive in a sequel. Sequels just change everything. The novelty is gone, the shock factor is reduced, the talking gun yelling at you saying, "Let's do it," is no longer a surprise. So the sequel either escalates wildly or it collapses into being the exact same game. High on Life 2 definitely starts off embracing that absurdity being cranked to 11, but then it pulls back into a new, still goofy, still similar experience, but new game with a skateboard. The skateboard immediately adds so much depth to the game, and I believe movement in gaming is always something to enjoy. Every time I have a game with movement options, I will play it more often than a game without it. Think grapple hooks, think dashing, and think rolling, and think skateboards. High on Life 2 has all of these. And that sounds simple, but in the context of an FPS, a comedic one at that, it is a massive yet fitting shift. If you look historically at comedy-driven games, they always fall into those two camps. Either the humor is the garnish on top of a mechanically strong core, or the humor is the core, and the mechanics are just there to move you between different punchlines. The original High on Life definitely leaned closer to the second category. It was charming because it was loud and it was unpredictable, but if you muted it, you could feel the seams. High on Life 2 felt like it studied that and built a game built on mechanical depth that the first one didn't really have the same way. The combat and the gunplay feels just a little bit tighter. The movement is faster, like I said with the skateboard. Abilities feel like they have impact, like an early on double jump that even works with the skateboard. And you have mechanical depth that adds to your weapons kits. There's less downtime when you're just waiting for the next joke to interrupt the action. Instead, there's a little bit more engagement in fights and rhythm. I'm not gonna lie and say that the whole game doesn't have long punchlines that you're waiting on, because it still is High on Life, right? You know what you're getting into. Rhythm is really the key of the game though. Comedy thrives on rhythm, setup, delivery, escalation, pauses, subversions. That same structure applies to good combat design. The fights need buildup, they need peaks, they need recovery, they need surprise. If those systems align, the experience feels cohesive instead of chaotic. An example of this I can give from my playtime was hunting down this rich mogul. It seemed like it was as simple as it gets. You just get in, you get out. Until I ended up on a bender with a gun who was in a bad spot in his marriage and, well, questioning his sexuality too. We ended up on a crazy path with lots of alien drugs and fights. Then we moved through doing some Tony Hawk Pro Skater letter collecting before going on a murder mystery party. Ladies and gentlemen, High on Life 2. The guns definitely still talk constantly. They still interrupt serious moments. They still spiral into arguments, but they're no longer carrying the entire weight of the engagement. They're a little bit more layered on top of combat that stands on its own for the player, and to be honest with you, I genuinely enjoyed the combination of movement, gunplay, and jokes, even if the jokes didn't always land. And that's where the sequel quietly differentiates itself. I talked about it before, but I want to bring attention to the core reason to play High on Life 2 if you enjoyed the first one. And that really is movement, guys. Like, it's that simple for me. The addition of the skateboard sounds like a throwaway joke until you actually use it. Traversal in the first game was functional and move you from absurd moment to absurd moment, but here the traversal feels like kinetic, like I can feel this. You're kick flipping alien cops in the face, you're grinding rails through areas that could have had flat corridors before, you're chaining movement in a way that keeps momentum high between fights. The momentum does two things. It reinforces the chaotic tone of the game, and obviously the absurd tone of the game, and it prevents stagnation with the game. One of the dangers in comedy games is really fatigue of the jokes, and you definitely still feel a little bit of that. When jokes pile up without mechanical variation, you definitely tend to burn out. But the skateboard introduces variation. It turns your downtime into a little bit more of a mini game. It gives your brain something to do, and you know, we're all TikTok builds, self included, so of course this helps. The environments also feel a little bit more constructed around concepts instead of just purely having a backdrop aesthetic. You're no longer just in an alien swamp or a random sci-fi backdrop. I mean, you definitely still are in alien worlds, but maybe not just a simple swamp. You're navigating what feels like a more fitting galaxy goofy world. You're exploring an alien zoo built specifically for human observation. You're infiltrating a luxury cruise liner that exists purely so it can be disrupted. Each of these spaces feels like it has a contained joke with the structures themselves. That is an upgrade from the original, where environments sometimes felt like containers for bits. Here, the bits and level design are a little bit more intertwined. The central narrative is about taking down a galactic pharmaceutical empire. Of course, with the game being named High on Life, it does make sense, but it stays within its own universe. It doesn't veer too much into real world politics, although I did find a joke very early on that had to do with a certain island.
But when you think about it, I'm not as bad as like Jeffrey Epstein or whatever.
It doesn't attempt to be topical commentary a lot unless you let characters speak for a while. It is cartoon villainy turned into sci-fi chaos, and it feels pretty intentional. Comedy games often struggle when they attempt to comment on real-world issues too directly. The humor can become dated, like watching an old South Park episode, but sometimes there's some banger jokes in there. The tone also becomes a little bit uneven, but High on Life 2 tries to avoid that trap by keeping everything heightened and a lot more fictional. There's also a little bit of a shift in the confidence that you can feel from the devs, like this isn't their first rodeo. The first game kind of felt like it was testing some boundaries with the jokes. It felt like it was waiting for you to kind of get it and then flinch a little bit, but the sequel feels like it knows its audience a lot more. It doesn't constantly kind of wink at you and stare through the screen like, haha, you get it? It just commits to the absurdity and lets it play out. And that confidence extends to the game's pacing. Like we said before, encounters transition smoothly, the combat arenas are structured to escalate, dialogue overlaps without suffocating in the action, and there's less of that awkward waiting period between jokes landing and the next objective triggering. This is where I think High on Life 2 truly succeeds. It just feels like the devs learned, and a lot more of the game feels more intentional. And intentional chaos is much harder to design than just some random joke just forced in there. The cast reinforces that tone as well. There's some all-star comedy energy in there. NPCs can spiral into bits that feel like they should have been cut but somehow survived development. Background dialogue refuses to behave like background dialogue. I can remember walking into the zoo and the guy at the counter just kept asking me about my day, and you could have just sat there for probably 20 minutes of dialogue. And I would have to guess that there was a lot of improv being done in the voice recording booth. But now those moments feel additive instead of compository. And that distinction really is everything, because comedy games should just enhance the gameplay and not remove them completely. And High on Life 2 feels like a game where the mechanics can stand on their own, which is definitely a big compliment. There's also something worth saying about sequels in general. Sequels are not about being bigger all the time. They're about being sharper, understanding what worked in the first one and just escalating that volume, even if you risk exhaustion. If you repeat the formula exactly, you definitely risk the question of who even asked for this? And if you pivot too far, you risk alienating that audience that made the first game viable. High on Life 2 finds its place in that perfect stoner kind of jokey, teenage fun, fart jokey game, which sometimes you need. You don't always need these giant live service machines. Sometimes you just need a fun game that's a good 10-hour story experience with some good jokes to make you feel good. And High on Life 2 definitely does that. High on Life 2 launches on February 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern and is available on Steam, Epic Games, Xbox, and PlayStation 5. If you want to experience the evolution for yourself, you can check it out through the link in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.